Stevenson, and as you've heard, this is Peter Ellerton. I'm going to start off this morning just by introducing the Australian Book of Atheism, and probably the most important thing is that it is Sunshine Coast born and bred. Warren Bonett, who was running owned and operated Embiggen Books, which is a science and philosophy bookshop at Noosaville, he and I met on the internet, as people do these days, and we decided to form the Sunshine Coast Atheist Group. And so we just started meeting for dinner at the Reef Hotel at Noosa once a month. And fairly early on, Warren and I were sitting over a steak and a glass of wine, and Warren said, you know, I've always wanted to put together a book about Australian atheism because I think it's quite different from atheism around the rest of the world. And completely naively, me, who had never been involved in producing books, said, oh, well, let's do it. And 2 years of really hard work later, we were absolutely astonished when we got a publisher and we saw our book on the bookshelves. It was tremendously exciting. I can remember just about the time it came out, I had to go to a conference in Sydney, and I was in Sydney Airport and made particular note to go to the news agency in Sydney Airport to see if the book was on the shelves. And then very embarrassingly, I was taking my camera and taking photos of it. So for those of you who are writers in the audience, or those of you who think they might like to edit a book, I think that we're proof that it's possible. I mean, Warren had a background in books and in book publishing, but he'd never edited a book. I had no clue what it was all about, and yet we were able to do it. We wrote to all these important people and said, you know, would you like to contribute a chapter to the book? We can't pay you any money. And then we spent the next 3 months dancing around our respective offices as people wrote back and said, we'd love to. And we got amazing people. We got Robin Williams from the Science Show, from the Radio National Science Show. We got former Senator Lynn Allison. We got Senator Lee Rhiannon from the Greens, and a Member of Parliament from New South Wales, Ian Hunter. We got the wonderful comedian and songwriter Tim Minchin, the euthanasia campaigner Philip Nitschke. So we were just amazed that all these well-known people, Leslie Canold, who writes for the Sun Herald, and Jane Caro, that you might know from the Gruen Transfer, all said yes, and we were absolutely honoured and dismayed. So it's been an absolute adventure, and the book has sold very well. It's available quite widely, and particularly in ABC bookshops, and it'll be available here today, I believe. So now I'd like to throw to Peter. What we're going to do today is I'm going to talk about my chapter in the book, which is a history of Australian atheism, and then I'll have a chat to Peter about his chapter. So Peter, take it away.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for coming along today. My own background is in education mostly, and I have taught physics and philosophy for a lot of years, which I find a very neat fit, which some people are surprised at, but I find it very good. When teaching philosophy, what becomes most significant, I think, as an educator is what critical thinking skills do students develop when they do that. And a lot of what I do has been trying to answer that question. Okay, what does it mean to teach students critical thinking skills? I can't exactly remember how I bumped into Warren, but it was at his, there's several ways we could have met, and I can't remember which one we did. But Warren knew what I was thinking and how I was operating in schools, and he said, well, would you do a chapter for the book? He mostly suggested, I think, or I can't remember who even thought of the topic. We have this ambiguous relationship.
So Warren is omnipotent. He
is omnipotent, isn't he? But it ended up being that theology is not philosophy. Now, everybody pretty much knows that, I think. In academic circles, there are no theologians who walk around saying we do philosophy all the time. And there's no philosophers who walk around saying we do theology. But it is a very, very common, I think, misunderstanding that theology and philosophy are the same things. Didn't really want to walk into that huge quagmire, but rather just talk about it from a critical thinking perspective. What happens if you teach students theology and you teach students philosophy? What do they gain from each? And I used to get a lot of schools saying, we'd like to introduce a philosophy course or a critical thinking course for our students. And then they'd come back and say, oh no, look, our board or our principal says that we do theology already, so that's good enough. And so I thought, well, okay, well, that's the market. That's the perspective from which I'm writing, to demonstrate that theology in the context of teaching critical thinking is not philosophy. So that brought me, I guess, to where I was. I understood the misunderstandings that people have about the knowledge that they gain in science or philosophy or whatever area of knowledge they work in. And I thought this was a great way to at least get a toehold into a bigger audience to say, here's what we mean by critical thinking and here's why theology doesn't deliver on that. And that brings me to here.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Would you like to...
I would like to get... Because this is the first time Chrys and I have actually met in real life. Virtually, we're old friends. But in the real world, we met for the first time. So I'll take the opportunity to ask Chrys a couple of questions that I've put together about her chapter on the history of Australian atheism. And first off, the book is extremely colourful when you talk about Australians, as you might imagine, the forging of the Australian character. But the role of particular atheists is really interesting. So when we had the first British immigrants here, Chrys, how is it that religion came or didn't come with those people?
Yes, well, we have to think about the first fleet sailing into Sydney Harbour loaded to the gunnels with good Christians, don't we? Actually, we think about the settlement of Australia, there was no religious agenda underlying the settlement of Australia. It was very much unlike America. And there's also a great difference in the time period. In America, we're looking at 1620. By 1788, the world had really moved on. There'd been many, many religious wars. People in Europe were sick to death of fights over religion. They'd moved into the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. 1789, just 1 year after the settlement of Australia, was the French Revolution. And that was very much an anti-clerical impulse behind that as well, because the clergy were very often drawn from the aristocracy. The clergy were seen as the corrupt defenders of the status quo by the working classes. So there were two strains. The French philosophers very greatly influenced the English, even though there was strain between England and France. But the intelligentsia in the 18th century were very much looking to science and reason, and it was really quite trendy, or as Doctor Who would say, it was cool to be an atheist at the time. So we have the military, which was very much a part of that intelligentsia, who really weren't much, at least not much, interested in religion and were quite disdainful of it. And these were the officers who came out on the First Fleet. Now, I'm generalising here, obviously, there were good God-fearing Christians as well. And the convicts themselves were not interested in religion, and if they thought about religion at all, it wasn't in happy terms. The historian Manning Clark actually says that Captain Arthur Phillip, was a non-believer and that he worshipped at the shrine of cool reason. And as for the convicts, there's a wonderful story about them trying to hand out Bibles on the transport ships. And it proved rather fruitless because the men tore out the pages to make playing cards and the women used the pages to curl their hair. Those that survived the journey were sold off in Sydney to buy rum. At the foundation ceremonies on the 26th of January 1788, the First Fleet chaplain, they did bring a chaplain out on the First Fleet, and his name was Richard Johnson. And he asked, quite reasonably I think, he asked Captain Phillip if he could say a blessing at the ceremonies. And Phillip said no. Johnson was later to write that I was made to stand under the shade of a tree and made to feel that neither God nor I was wanted at the foundation of the new nation. So I think that speaks volumes about those who say we're a Christian nation. Certainly from that point, at that point, there was no consideration that we were a Christian nation at all. Poor old Johnson, he tried for 6 years to get Phillip to build him a church. And Phillip just had other priorities. There were so many other things to do, so many other things to care about, that Phillip just wasn't interested. And even after Phillip left and King took over, there was no church. And finally, Johnson, very reluctantly, built the church out of his own money. But it was very poorly attended. It was built to house 500 and barely 40 people turned up for the first Christmas service. And so eventually, when Hunter came, he decided that he would make church attendance compulsory. And so the convicts burned the church down. So really, to answer your question, the religion, although it was there, but really most people had other priorities. They were setting up a new nation. Religion really wasn't a top priority for anyone. The convicts certainly weren't interested in it. It was just cramping their style. And so religion really didn't start to flourish in Australia until after the convict era and the free settlers were coming in. And then it was an impulse from the middle class, or the rising middle class from the freed convicts, to respectability rather than any sense of religiosity, I think. So religion did accompany the first British immigrants, but really they really weren't much interested in it.
Yeah, they had a lot of baggage, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.